vast majority of marketers really don't need to take action today. There's often this impulse when something enters the marketing and advertising ecosystem that everyone feels like there's got to be the impulse to take action or we're going to be left behind. I think this is something that's going to have to play out over a much longer period of time.
Hey gang, it's Monday, December 13th. Andrew and listeners, welcome to the Behind the Numbers Daily, the eMarketer podcast made possible by Basis Technologies. I'm still Marcus, and today I'm joined by one of our principal analysts covering retail and e-commerce. It's Andrew Lipsman.
Hey, Marcus.
Hey chap, thanks for hanging out. Today's fact: more people live in New York City than in the entirety of most states. So with 8.5 million people living in New York City, that means that 38 of America's 50 states, or 49 if you got rid of New York, have fewer people living in their entire state than people live in New York. Andrew, I did Chicago, because that's where you are. Andrew, population 2.7 million. That's more people that live in Chicago than live in 15 American states. Why do we do it to ourselves? It's so cramped. So cramped.
Chicago feels like a pretty big city to me. New York is more than 3 times bigger.
Yeah. That's true. Chicago didn't feel cramped though. New York felt like I had 8.5 million roommates. It's a disaster. Anyway, today's real topic, a framework for thinking about the metaverse. All right, folks, thanks for joining me for this episode. Andrew, thank you as well. Otherwise, I'm just talking to myself. What we're going to do here is, there's so much to talk about with the metaverse. We were going to do one episode. We've done one before, but we were preparing for a second, and there's so many articles, so much research on this coming out that we decided that we would put on kind of a mini residency, if you will, a mini series of metaverse episodes. So you can expect probably one of these every 2 weeks or so. Andrew has been good enough to volunteer his time to join me for those episodes. So you'll hear me and Andrew talking about the metaverse once every 2 weeks or so for, I don't know, probably the next couple of months, maybe even beyond that, because there's just so much to discuss. We might not get one in before the end of December, because it's at the end of December, apparently is tomorrow, but we will be probably doing an episode every 2 weeks from January, talking about the metaverse. There's so much to talk about. What is it as a concept? That's what we'll be tackling today, and a framework for thinking about it. There's the key players, what types of use case, the content, why metaverse is a bad idea, who's building it, what are the tech players that are building it. So that and much more to talk about, how advertisers can get involved. We'll start, Andrew, with the concept of the metaverse and trying to define the metaverse. From some of your reading, how are you thinking about this concept?
Yeah, well, I think for anybody to understand the concept, we need to start with Matthew Ball. Yep. He is the one who really had the genesis for this idea. Now, I should say that his thinking on this topic, which started really just about 2 years ago, ultimately stems from some science fiction novel dating back to 1992 called Snow Crash by Neil Stephenson. Mm-hmm. Matthew Ball's incarnation of it is interesting. I actually read his initial blog post a few years ago.
You say blog post, it's an essay.
It's an essay,
on the
yes,
blog.
Very long, and there have been many subsequent
really good.
essays.
Really good.
Yes, he is a very clear thinker on this and many other media-driven topics. And really, he first aroused my interest in talking about things with, Netflix and other forms of TV media. So that's how I first started following him. But he was always kind of talking about gaming and gaming-related concepts. I'm not much of a gamer, so I sort of ignored those. But part of me was like, maybe I should listen to this guy. He's so smart on other stuff. He might be onto something. And I think the first time that I really tuned into him when he was talking about some of these concepts was when he unveiled this idea of the metaverse. So I think that's probably a good place to start. What is Matthew Ball's definition?
Yeah. What is it? What does he think it is? Because I've read, there's probably 20 different articles in the last couple of, well, at least in the last month about what it is and what it isn't. What does Matthew Ball say?
Well, I'll start by reading kind of his formal definition, which I think he came to more recently after putting more thought behind it. But he defines it as the metaverse is a massively scaled and interoperable network of real-time rendered 3D virtual worlds, which can be experienced synchronously and persistently by an effectively unlimited number of users with an individual sense of presence, and with continuity of data such as identity, history, entitlements, objects, communications, and payments. So a bit of a mouthful, but I think it starts to paint a picture of his conception.
Within that definition, I noticed the word synchronously, and I started thinking, could you experience things asynchronously? I mean, it's less of a use case, but you could jump into a virtual world that has been recorded, and you would jump into that world, Andrew, and play the sequence of events, and I would as well. And maybe you can't interact with people in the same way, but there is a version of this which could be, in theory, asynchronous.
Well, it's already starting to make my mind melt a little bit to think about that. But the synchronous part of it is that this metaverse, right? It's always on.
Yes.
It exists kind of ubiquitously in the world around us. So at any given time, people can interact within that world. But presumably that time and place is fixed just like in the real world.
Right. Absolutely. That's what it's going to be. But I guess my thinking is, could you take a recording of what's going on in that world and play it back later? Again, a much smaller use case. It is just going to be this world that continues to move, whether you're inside the world or not. Yeah.
So a couple other points in descriptions that he's given for the metaverse. He says it's best understood as a quasi-successor state to the mobile internet.
Mm-hmm.
This is because it will not fundamentally replace the internet, but instead build upon and iteratively transform it. He also says, and I think this is really important to distinguish, most commonly the metaverse is misdescribed as virtual reality. In truth, virtual reality is merely a way to experience the metaverse. To say VR is the metaverse is like saying the mobile internet is an app.
That's an interesting point, because I was reading a New York Times piece and they were citing Mike Winkelmann, aka Beeple, who, let me see how to define, known as an American digital artist, an animator. He's the guy who sold an NFT of his artwork for nearly $70 million. He thinks people are very much looking at this thing as Ready Player One or a VR thing, but he says that's just about how close the screen is to your face. So I thought that was a really good way of looking at this. It's not just VR, it's other stuff. VR just happens to be really close to your face, so it feels like that is the metaverse, or a most immersive form of it. Andrew, it does seem that people can agree on the fact that unlike current VR, which is mostly used for gaming, this virtual world could be used for anything. Whether it's concerts, hanging out with folks, going to the movies, work, play, it's going beyond gaming. Right now, a lot of people might think of games like Roblox, Fortnite, etc., but this is a space where you could, in theory, do anything just in a virtual world.
That's right. And I think that distinction is really critical. And in fact, that phrasing from Matthew Ball that I just read for the audience here, that was kind of a key unlock for me, because I had not put too much thought into the metaverse prior to us starting to discuss it offline. And I think I probably started to think of it in those VR terms. And, that's where a bit more of my skepticism comes in, as the ultimate use case for VR. I think, some really cool applications will occur. It's going to be very interesting. But when I think about this as kind of the successor to the mobile internet, that's where I have a hard time believing that this is the next platform. If I take a broader view in this bigger conception of having this kind of ubiquitous layer existing in the world around us that you can kind of plug into and out of, depending on the situation and the context, that's where I think things start to get pretty interesting.
Right. Yeah. I mean, finally on Matthew Ball, he says there will be no clean before metaverse and after metaverse. So what he writes, instead it will slowly emerge over time as different products, services and capabilities integrate and meld together. And after reading that kind of really helped my thinking on the concept of like, wait, did we start this already? When I didn't hear the starter pistol, and wait, are we going to, when do we finish? It's not that. It's that this has been evolving and becoming more and more of a thing. And now it's probably evolved to a point where you can kind of crystallize and kind of make out some shapes and symbols of what this thing is going to start to look like. But there is no beginning and end point, so to speak, despite, certain people referencing this at certain times throughout history.
I mean, that's a great point, right? This there is no starter gun here. It's not something that just started just because we started hearing about it.
Right.
When I think about virtual worlds, I go back, almost 15 or 20 years to Second Life and some of the earlier incarnations of virtual worlds on the internet.
Yes.
Even before that, things like SimCity on computers. I mean, these things have been around for a long time in different forms. As the technology evolves, they're going to become richer and richer experiences, but it's not a new concept.
Yep. And that was one of the points from an Economist article, which was titled, "Don't Mock the Metaverse. The Metaverse is already here. It's just not evenly distributed." It goes on to explain why there are good reasons to take the metaverse seriously. One of them is, to your point, there are already and have been these digital worlds that people hang out in all the time. Online game EverQuest, launched in 1999, 1999. They had 500,000 subscribers at its peak. Players quickly started socializing on that, having weddings there, as well as playing the actual game where you kill dragons and things. World of Warcraft arrived 5 years later. That hit 12 million. 200 million people a month hang out on Roblox. Fortnite's one of the most popular games ever. You've mentioned SimCity. The Sims was a hit. Second Life as well was a thing. And many people are already spending their real money in the virtual world. So they say it's hard to argue that an idea will ever catch on when for millions of people it already has. And you could argue, if you own an NFT or cryptocurrency, you could be considered part of the metaverse to some people if you're using virtual or augmented reality, if you're playing Roblox, Fortnite, Animal Crossing. So the lines are very blurred, is what we're trying to say. That said, Andrew, you have been trying to formulate a kind of larger concept of thinking here. So moving on from the general concept of what the metaverse is, let's take it a step further in thinking in terms of the larger concept of the metaverse and what it can do and what it is going to be.
Yeah, well, so I think we're going to start to talk really big picture here and start to get into some nebulous territory. So let me just preface it by saying, first off, my thinking, and I think all of our thinking, is going to have to evolve over time. So this is just trying to lay out some framework for how to think about it now. Mm-hmm. But, our audience is a lot of marketers. So one thing that I will say at the outset is the vast majority of marketers really don't need to take action today, right? There's often this impulse when something enters the marketing and advertising ecosystem that everyone feels like there's got to be the impulse to take action or we're going to be left behind. I think This is something that's going to have to play out over a much longer period of time. And so it's really like the takeaway for most marketers, brands at this moment is start learning and thinking about it. But you don't need to start shifting budgets or investing significantly. There are a handful of exceptions. We'll get to those in time.
Right.
But I think many of them are already doing it. If you're, a marketer who's not already very keyed in on this, you're probably pretty safe for a while, not overinvesting.
And even Facebook, who you could point to as being responsible for a lot of the most recent hysteria about the metaverse, because they changed their name from Facebook to Meta, and they were rolling out some versions of their vision of the metaverse quite recently at an event. Even Facebook thinks the true metaverse idea will take another 10 to 15 years. So even the people building it and who seem to be the most invested in this, or one of the most invested, they even say, give us time. It's not going to be a thing for a while. And also, Andrew, there are other versions of the metaverse. The BBC was noting that Unity, a 3D development platform, is investing in something called digital twins, which are digital copies of the real world. And then the graphics company NVIDIA is building its Omniverse, which it describes as a platform for connecting 3D virtual worlds. So not only is it going to be tricky to figure out where to play in the metaverse, there are other verses, so to speak, that may be coming along. So definitely pump the brakes, it's kind of scan the field and take very small baby steps, if any at all, at this point.
People in the metaverse, avatars, don't even have legs yet. So maybe as a quick rule of thumb, let's wait for people to have legs and then ask yourself the question, should I be investing in the metaverse?
I think that's a fair way of thinking about it. All right, time for In Other News, but first a quick word from our sponsor, Basis Technologies. Today's podcast is made possible by Basis Technologies. Basis Technologies has created a digital advertising platform that connects people, automates processes, and unifies channels, bringing together programmatic, site direct, search, social, and CTV into one single interface. And through the power of automation, Basis enables brands, agencies, and publishers to build and operate a healthy, secure, efficient, and profitable advertising organization. Ready to take control of your advertising? Go to basis.net today. That's www.basis.net. Basis Technologies, the future of advertising has arrived. So, Andrew, we'd mentioned about virtual reality just being kind of one gateway into this world, but it does seem to be a very highly discussed and often talked about one at this point. What's your position thinking about the virtual reality portal into this world in 2021?
Yeah, well, so a lot of this, the genesis really comes from big tech and wanting to control the next big platform. Yeah. And I think there is this line of thinking that says, what's next after the mobile internet? And the logical conclusion that many seem to be coming to is the metaverse or virtual reality. And I see virtual reality as something that's inherently extremely immersive, right? It is, you have to put goggles on and you have to give it your full undivided attention. And some of the applications that will come out of that will be very cool. But I tend to see that more through the lens of gaming. Gaming itself is a major media ecosystem. It's a big part of the landscape. It provides competition to other things, but it's not the dominant platform. I think the dominant platform of the future is still mobile. There's a reason why I think mobile has been so dominant. It's because it's always with us. There's a lot of functionality and it can come and go at any moment's notice. And it solves problems at so many points throughout the day. So that's what the dominant platform ultimately will be. So mobile internet, not going anywhere. VR and Metaverse, these will be layers built upon it. But I see the VR basically taking a slice of people's attention and not overcoming, the existing forms of media. I think about like when mobile came along, it's important to recognize that it did not make desktop obsolete, right? We still use desktop all the time to do work because mobile's not good at us doing work. When desktop came along, it didn't make TV obsolete, right? We still watch TVs on our screens in our home because you can do it on desktop and it has some advantages if you want to take that screen somewhere, but it also has disadvantages. So I think we just need to recognize that each media platform has relative strengths and weaknesses, and they'll all take up different parts of the overall media consumption landscape. But I just have a hard time ever getting to envisioning a reality where the VR component is, the biggest one or even, second or third biggest.
Yeah, it just feels like it's too immersive for mass adoption. We were sharing a video and an article accompanying the video by Joanna Stern of the Wall Street Journal, which we talked about, I think, on the last episode, where she puts on this headset for 24 hours and she lives inside the metaverse, quote unquote metaverse, for 24 hours. She can sleep and she can eat without the headset on, but everything else she does in this world. And she was exhausted by the time she took it off. Andrew, I know you had some interesting observations from that as well.
Oh, it was the same thing. I mean, she was just wiped out, right? I mean, you got a real feel for it that how exhausted are we doing Zoom meetings all day long, right?
Right.
That requires a level of immersion that we're not used to. Some of us have had to take some Zoom timeouts, in fact. And so, put that on steroid and you start to understand the reality of spending hours upon hours with a virtual reality headset on.
Yeah, but you pointed out there were some applications which she did seem to greatly prefer versus others.
She thought the fitness application was pretty cool.
That was it.
Right? And so I think back to Wii, when Nintendo Wii, when that first took off, that was like a new form of video game mixed with fitness, right? So to me, this is almost like an evolution of that. So I think there's something there that I think we'll probably talk about in subsequent episodes. But yes, so that gives you a taste of how there are some applications that are going to be pretty cool.
Yeah. I want to quickly mention as well, because of the immersivity, is that a word? Immersiveness?
It is now.
We're talking about the metaverse. I can make anything up at this point. Immersivity. That's definitely not a word. I think I mean immersiveness. I don't know what I mean. But immersivity for the sake of this episode, because of how immersive virtual reality is, it does make me wonder whether this is going to be good for society and whether there are going to, because there are already questions about the attention economy and what other tech companies are doing to just digital video platforms to just grab as much attention from you as possible, whether they're using dark patterns, what's going on in algorithms. And I do think we're going to get more and more questions about, is this good for society? And you see more Americans living alone than ever before. You see rates of anxiety, according to some numbers, you see rates of anxiety and depression at record levels. And there's a million reasons why, and it's hard to prove, correlation versus causation. But I do think, especially for brands who aren't, leaping into this space right now, but, society and for brands as well, there is going to be some kind of pumping of the brakes in terms of whether this is going to be a good look to be getting into this type of immersive technology.
We worry how people treat each other online and through social media today, right? And the level of discourse. If you take that level of impersonal nature where people, when they're behind a screen, feel like they can act a certain way, but make it a much more realistic like context, yes, I have absolutely a lot of concerns for where this all goes.
Mm-hmm. Finally, let's talk about this idea of time and space, because I kind of asked you to do this episode. You went away, and I can only imagine what the pinboard looks like in your house in terms of where the strings are being attached. It probably looks like the FBI's like 10 most wanted list where they're trying to solve a case. There's all these different Polaroids linked up. Talk to me a bit about, you came back with this idea of time and space, which I think is a fascinating way of thinking about things at this juncture. Talk to us about this concept.
Well, Marcus, I went on a bit of a metaphysical journey
It seems
into
like
the nether regions of my head. No, I mean, your brain can go in so many directions trying to take on the metaverse. One of the things that I started to think about was this notion of time, right? The metaverse, like the primary components to me are time and space, and how it brings people together in a virtual universe of physical space with respect to time. So I started picking at this idea of time, and I thought, what's been happening fundamentally in society is that we used to have a lot of activities that were based on synchronous time, where we all did things together. We had primetime TV that everybody tuned in at the same time. We had different events that people did at the same time. We went to work in the same place at the same time to get there. We all went into rush hour traffic at the same time, right? Our lives were lived around synchronicity. Mm-hmm. What's been happening really through the advent of digital is that more and more aspects of our lives have become asynchronous. If you think about TV, we don't watch as much linear TV. It's on demand on Netflix. And even commerce, we don't have to go to stores at the same time. We just order through e-commerce in the middle of the night if we feel like it. Mm-hmm. Food comes to us on demand. All these different things where we used to have to go to specific places at specific times to engage. Now that was happening on our own time. Mm-hmm. I think that was the kind of long-term trend underlying a societal transition. And the pandemic really accelerated that, right? So some of those core tent poles in our day, like going to work, all of a sudden that time, it became asynchronous and people are working on more flexible schedules. And so now I feel like we've kind of moved into a default way of living where we are on kind of asynchronous time. It's been said in business that there are fundamentally two business models, bundling and unbundling. And I think about the fact that really what's been happening is that time has been unbundled into its component parts that each individual then can take and sort of atomize and use their time and fit it into their day, at their own discretion. Yes, there are some constraints, but I think that's more of the dominant mode today. So what happened in the pandemic? Who were some of the big winners of the pandemic? If you think about what were the high flyer stocks or companies that were really spotlighted in the pandemic? Zoom, number one, mm-hmm. right? Peloton. Another one that flew a little bit under the radar, but was a big one, was Eventbrite. Mm-hmm. What happened with these companies is that I would say that as things became asynchronous, their value was by sort of resynchronizing things, right? We lose something when we asynchronize. And so they actually created value by resynchronizing. So Zoom resynchronized work. Peloton resynchronized fitness. If you couldn't do it in a spin studio, you could do it with other people virtually at the same time. Eventbrite, was about events. They were selling tickets to virtual events. So when people couldn't go to different events or conferences, Eventbrite came in and helped them resynchronize. So I see this idea of kind of resynchronization around time and space as kind of one of the fundamental value drivers or pillars of the metaverse.
So one of the big questions of the pandemic has been, will people go back to what they were doing? And I do wonder, how much of that can the metaverse capture? How much of that resynchronization can the metaverse capture? And how quickly is it going to have to develop apps or devices that pull people into those digital worlds or keep people in those digital worlds versus them just going back to the gym or going back to the doctor's office or going back to the actual office? How much do you think that the metaverse can actually get people to stay in that digital world versus them kind of having a bit of a kind of a whiplash back to what they were doing beforehand?
So I think we're working in shades of gray, right? It's not all or none in terms of these transitions. But when I say it was asynchronous is now more of the dominant mode, I do think there was a switch point that happened in the pandemic. And now, even as people are living in this kind of hybrid world of online, offline, physical, digital, that the dominant mode is that digital asynchronized time. And so there will be a need. What you lose in that is human connection, right? I mean, I think that's the fundamental thing that we lack. And we haven't really reckoned with that or really wrapped our heads collectively around what that means when we lose that human connectivity. So I do feel like that's not going to go away. It's part of what it is to be human, and that is a role that the metaverse can help fulfill.
All right. Time now for the post-game report. Andrew, a couple of takeaways from you, if you could, if it's possible.
I think the first thing, if I can distill this into one thing, wait for legs. Wait until we have legs on avatars before you dive in head first.
That's fair.
No, I mean, listen, the metaverse it's a big concept, and I think this is really fun to start thinking about. It's going to change. My thinking's going to change. And, I think it's going to be interesting to watch us all evolve. And I'm just looking forward to batting around ideas with you and other folks to try and make sense of what is a big and quite nebulous concept at this point in time.
Mm-hmm. Two things for me. One from The Economist, we were talking about their piece about cautioning on how much you should mock this concept. One of the things they said is that we've mocked things before. When YouTube launched in 2005, it was a dating site. And people wondered why anyone would want to watch spotty teenagers filming themselves in their bedrooms when cable TV was an option. And in 16 years, online dating has gone from being furtive and embarrassing to take its place as a perfectly normal and often preferred way to meet people. And we all know where YouTube is at this point, 16 years later. And smartphones, now some of the best-selling devices ever built, were in the 1990s brick-sized eyesores that were mocked as crass status symbols for insecure investment bankers. So we've definitely mocked things in the past. And the second point here from John Herman and Kellen Browning of the New York Times, they explain that jargon often appears out of nowhere, underexplained and overused, but we've had things before which would fit that description. The Internet of Things, the sharing economy, even the cloud. You could even say the internet when it was getting off the ground. Andrew, the next episode in our mini Metaverse series, we're going to try and dive into some of the key players and the most compelling content and applications that we expect to see in the near term. So listeners, stay tuned for that episode sometime in early January. That is all we have time for this episode. Thank you so much, Andrew, for hanging out and trying to figure this thing out with me.
Thanks, Marcus. This was fun.
Absolutely. Thanks to Victoria. She edits the show. And thanks to everyone listening. We'll see you tomorrow for the Behind the Numbers Daily, an eMarketer podcast made possible by Basis Technologies.